For hundreds of years, after the crucifixion of Christ, Rome persecuted Christians. They nailed them to crosses, set them on fire by the dozens in arenas, whipped them, beat them, humiliated them, and fed them to lions, leopards, bears, and dogs. Thousands upon thousands were killed. Others went into hiding. But the persistence, faith, conviction, and perseverance in reported miracles, Christianity eventually became the state religion of the Western Roman Empire under Emperor Theodosius I in 38. By the early 17th century, Christianity had spread and had begun to spread to almost all corners of the world, including the then isolated and remote island of Japan. It estimated that there were about 300,000 Christians in Japan, mostly in the south, in 1635 and 1640. The only Christians left in Japan were hiding their faith, hiding themselves, or both. In 1614, the Japanese government led by Songjun Tokugawa Ieyasu determined that Christianity was a threat to their rule and the traditional customs and beliefs of Japan. They banned foreign missionaries and forbade the practice of Christianity in Japanese islands, but they did not stop the growth of the religion, and the religion that promoted the idea of turning the other cheek continued to grow, especially in the south, where it had first arrived Spanish and Portuguese priests and monks. So, beginning shortly after 1614 and becoming more severe through the 1630s, Ieyasu had the Christians in Japan, both Japanese and non-Japanese alike, killed. Welcome to Memory Lane, where we bring you some of the most unusual and darker chapters of human history. In all likelihood, the first Europeans to arrive in Japan were Portuguese sailors who had been blown off course on their way to the Asian mainland in late 1490s. But the real beginning of European influence in Japan began in 1543 when a successor of Portuguese traders arrived in the country, the most prominent being Panel Mendes Pinto, who had sailed in India several times, as well as China, the Philippines, and the famous Spice Islands, the Moluccas, northeast of Indonesia. He later wrote a detailed book about his voyages in Asia, including Japan. Pinto and other Portuguese traders sold spices and several arquebuses and early handheld firearms. The Japanese were intrigued but wary. For centuries, the only people they had contact with were Koreans, Chinese, Okinawans, and others of the Ryukyu Islands, which at the time were a tributary state of China, not Japan. These kingdoms had similar, though different cultures, a shared history going back centuries, and shared to a great degree ideas about religion or spirituality. They also had a similar appearance to one another. The Europeans were utterly different. Their shapes were different. Their clothing was different. Their appearances was radically different. So the food they ate, their luggage was absolutely unrelated to anything the Japanese knew, and the religion and spiritual beliefs were different in the extreme. Pinto and other Portuguese traders, explorers, did not include missionaries or anyone trying to spread Christianity. They did not even know if they would be allowed to anchor in Japan. They were there to trade and to evaluate Japan and check out the prospects for trade and influence there. Only two European nations had practical knowledge of the land and seas of Asia at that point: Portugal and Spain, two closely related allies. Most importantly, they were both Catholic. The Catholicism of that time was a highly evangelical religion. When numbers of Portuguese and Spanish traders and military men went, priests and monks went with them. Remember, it took good 6 months to make the journey from the Iberian Peninsula to Japan. It could be done in 4 months with luck by going through the Magallanes Pass at the southern tips of South America, discovered in 1520 by the famous Portuguese explorer. Only the Spanish and Portuguese knew about the pass until the 1587 when the first English ship, the Privateer Dolphin, sailed into the Pacific. Going through the pass and across the Pacific was extremely dangerous, though so most sailed around Africa into the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia into the China Seas and beyond, staying as close as the coast as possible. The enemies of Portugal and Spain, the Protestant English and Dutch, were largely kept out of Asia by the size of the Spanish and Portuguese fleet. So it took about a year to get to Japan and back from Portugal, adding stopovers for trade and resupply along the way, as well as securing financing and finding a crew brave and knowledgeable enough to go. And the return trip could take years. Pinto and others also had to convince the Portuguese and Spanish rulers that the trip was worth it in terms of money, power, and religion. At the time, Portugal and Spain were extremely religious, one might say fanatically Catholic, for the Protestant Reformation had begun in 1517 and spread throughout Northern Europe. The Portuguese, Spanish and Italians, and all popes with one exception until 1978 were Italian, saw themselves as defenders of the true faith. They saw it as their duty to spread Christianity in its Catholic form around the world. Francis Xavier, the co-founder of the Jesuit order with Ignatius Loyola, arrived in the southern city of Kagoshima on its island of Kyushu with two other monks in 1549. They received permission from the local daimyo or lord to travel his lands, and while there, Xavier learned Japanese and began to convert Christian texts written in Latin to Japanese. He traveled through Kyushu, preaching and making converts. When he went to the capital, Kyoto, he was told in no uncertain terms not to preach or try to convert any Japanese there. Kyoto was not only the shogun's capital, but also home to the emperor. The emperor was not only treated as a god, but was believed to be divine. Despite having no real political power, it would not do for a foreign and barbarian religion to be taught in Kyoto. One of the things that Japan is famous for today is its ability to take elements of foreign ideas and inventions and somehow make them uniquely Japanese. It was the same before the arrival of Christianity. Before and for some time after the arrival of the first Europeans, Japan was greatly influenced by China and Chinese culture, though they are quite distinct today. Japanese language and writing have ancient roots in China. The same is true for religious and spiritual beliefs to a degree. Through the centuries, the Japanese developed their own ideas about the beginning of the universe and the foundation of their island country. Many of these beliefs, along the notion of harmony and personal enlightenment, are part of the native Japanese religion of Shinto. One of the many interesting things about Shinto is that it has been very open to outside influence or wars until the arrival of Christianity. Shinto includes a veneration of spirits and spirits known as kami, and includes the practice of meditation, enlightenment, and a life of harmony with others and nature are also elements of the many forms of Buddhism that came to Japan through China. Philosophy of Confucius, known in the West as the Confucius, also came to Japan from China. The importance of family loyalty and obedience, as well as to one's superiors, also made its way into Japanese culture. Japan has a famous saying: Shinto is for weddings, Buddhism is for funerals, and Confucianism is for everyday life. What is not included is the idea of a single supreme being who sent his son in human form to earth to save it from sin, and who preached universal love and peace, and who also rose from the dead, and who looked nothing like them. The idea of sin was alien to Japanese, but the ideas of the meek inheriting the earth, and the last becoming first, and the first becoming last, along with the idea of a perfect heaven, were really appealing to many Japanese, especially those on the bottom of the social ladder. In most Japanese were at the bottom. From movies like The Last Samurai and others, many people in America and Europe think of the samurai as honorable, heroic warriors, and many were. They were also only about 7 to 10% of the Japanese population and ruled over the other 90% with an absolute iron fist. In 1601, just before the great persecution of Christians in Japan, the Tokugawa family ruled the country in the emperor's name. They brought order and stability to the country that had seen hundreds of years of war, and Japan began flourishing. But there was a cost: obey or die. When the third Tokugawa shogun, Himetsu, took over in 1623, he issued edicts that many historians believe made Japan almost totalitarian. Permits were needed for nearly everything. Checkpoints were everywhere. So were spies, informers, and samurai forces. For most samurai, life was pretty good. It was exceedingly hard for everyone else, but complaints were answered with the sword. Most crimes were capital crimes, even before the arrival of Christianity. The Japanese used crucifixion as a means of execution. It's also true that a samurai could kill a commoner for any perceived disobedience, though this wasn't as common as it's made out to be in the Western movies and TV shows. Not because killing was a sin, but because it brought a loss of harmony and might eventually cause peasant rebellions, which happened in Japan occasionally. Though many Japanese converts to Christianity were not samurai, a surprising number were. Some did so attracted by the idea of life after death and the ideas of brotherhood in Christianity, which was similar to the ideas within Confucianism. Many daimyo also liked Matthew 22:15-22. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. Caesar being translated in Japanese to mean emperor and those in command. Initially, the Japanese did not see Christianity as a threat, but with every ship arriving in Japan came missionaries. Because the shogun valued trade with the Europeans and their technologies, he permitted the Catholic Church to build churches, missions, and monasteries in the country. Again, mainly, but not only in the south. Unfortunately for the Christians of Japan, not all European missionaries were concerned with just spreading the gospel. Many were also concerned with increasing the church's political power and that of the Portuguese and the Spanish. By 1600s, Europeans controlled most of the Japan's trade with China. Today, it would be a multi-billion-dollar industry. The Spanish and Portuguese also worked to convert the bribe diamo into favorable trade deals and for political information and influence. In the historical novel and TV series Shogun, the British sailor tells the shogun that the Pope had divided the undiscovered world between the Spanish and Portuguese in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. The Pope is a representative of Christ on earth. The discovery of this treaty by the Japanese may not have happened like this. However, Shogun is based on a true story that we can safely say the Japanese were not pleased with the treaty or the fact that the Europeans had kept it secret. In 1614, Christianity was made illegal under the second Tokugawa shogun, Hidetada. The persecution began. However, it was relatively restrained compared to what came later, because until 1633, the Japanese still had to consider what the Europeans could think and do. On February 5th, 1597, even before the law outlawing Christianity, 56 Catholic priests and monks, both native Japanese and Europeans, were killed in Nagasaki. They were crucified publicly. Relations between the Europeans and Japan suffered, and the persecution eased for a time. In 1623, Iemitsu became shogun. Violence against Christians increased every year. In 1633, Iemitsu issued the Koku Edict, which effectively banned foreigners from Japan, except for selected small port areas around Hiroshima. This also meant that the Japanese did not travel outside their country. When the edict was issued, anyone outside Japan was not permitted to return without permission on pain of death. Iemitsu and those close to him were determined to keep Japan pure. In the mid-1630s, persecution really began. In 1637, the rebellion by predominantly Christian peasants began against the daimyo in the Shimabara region, who taxed them into starvation. In reaction, the government cracked down hard. They started a sweep of the region, killing many Christians on the spot by beheading. Others were forced to renounce their faith while being repeatedly dropped into boiling water, crucified, or threatened with the death of their children, most of which happened anyway. One of the most infamous methods of death was the heading of Christians towards cliff overlooking the sea. All over the country, men, women, and children were pushed off the cliffs to their deaths, either on the rock below or under the crashing waves. Babies were often tossed in afterwards. Like in ancient Rome, Christians went into hiding. Some did renounce their faith, some said they did and practiced the religion privately, but this was risky, as informants, including their children, were everywhere. Historians in Europe and Japan estimate about 300,000 Christians were killed in the last half of the 1630s. Christianity survived in Japan, but barely. Christians make up just over 1% of the Japanese population of 123 million today. For more unusual and darker chapters of human history, remember to like and subscribe to stay updated with all our recent videos.